The peace was never real. That is the first thing you need to understand before anything else in this story makes any sense at all. The decades that historians would later call the Cold War were not characterized by an absence of conflict. They were characterized by the constant management of conflict, by the bureaucratic domestication of annihilation, by the transformation of mass death from an event into a process. While the world went about its business, while children went to school and workers punched time cards and families ate dinner and watched television, the machinery of total war was running continuously in the background, staffed by human beings whose entire professional purpose was to prepare for the end of civilization and ensure that if it came correctly. The systems that were built during those decades did not rust when the Berlin Wall fell. The doctrines that were written did not dissolve when the Soviet Union ceased to exist. The habits of thought that were cultivated across 2 generations of military planners and intelligence analysts and weapons designers did not simply stop the moment that the formal adversarial relationship changed its official status. What ended in 1991 was a political arrangement. What did not end was the architecture, the hardware, the institutional memory, and the deep structural logic of mutual assured destruction. That is not an opinion. That is a description of what actually happened. And the only way to understand what that means is to go back to where it started and follow the thread without looking away. In the years immediately following the Second World War, the United States found itself in a position that had no real historical precedent. It possessed a weapon of almost incomprehensible destructive power, and it was the only country on Earth that possessed it. The atomic bomb had ended one war and immediately began to define the terms of the next potential conflict. American military planners looked at this situation and drew what seemed to them to be a rational conclusion. If a single bomb could destroy a city, then the possession of many bombs and the credible willingness to use them would prevent any adversary from challenging American interests in ways that could escalate to large-scale conflict. This logic was clean and appealing, and it shaped everything that followed. The problem was that the Soviet Union was not going to remain without nuclear weapons indefinitely. American intelligence analysts understood this, even if they were wrong about the timeline. The Soviets tested their first atomic device in August of 1949, years earlier than most American planners had projected. The reasons for that acceleration were partly scientific, partly industrial, and partly the result of one of the most consequential intelligence operations in history, a network of sources embedded inside the Manhattan Project itself who had been passing information to Moscow for years. When the Soviet test was detected by American monitoring aircraft sampling the atmosphere over the Pacific, the response inside the American government was not calm. It was the beginning of a panic that would last, in various forms, for the next 4 decades. What followed from that panic was not a single decision or a single plan. It was the gradual construction of an entire parallel civilization. A shadow infrastructure of bunkers and command centers and communication networks and weapons stockpiles and targeting databases and evacuation protocols and continuity of government schemes, all of it built alongside the visible world, mostly invisible to the people who lived in the visible world, and dedicated entirely to the proposition that nuclear war could be survived, managed, and if necessary, won. The people who built this infrastructure were not madmen. They were bureaucrats and engineers and military officers and scientists, people with families and normal lives and professional ambitions, and they went to work every day and did their jobs, which happened to involve planning for the incineration of hundreds of millions of human beings. The first serious American nuclear war plan was called the Emergency War Plan, and it was developed in the late 1940s before the Soviets had even tested their first weapon. The basic concept was straightforward. If war broke out with the Soviet Union, the United States would immediately deploy its entire atomic arsenal against Soviet cities, industrial centers, and military installations. The goal was not simply to win the war. The goal was to destroy the Soviet Union's capacity to wage war so thoroughly and so quickly that effective resistance would become impossible. The plan called for the use of somewhere between 50 and 100 atomic bombs in the opening days of a conflict. The targeting was primarily urban. The anticipated casualties were in the tens of millions. What is important to understand about this plan, and about all the plans that followed it, is that it was not a contingency of last resort. It was the primary operational concept. American military strategy in the late 1940s and early 1950s was built on the assumption that if a major war began, nuclear weapons would be used immediately and massively. The idea that there might be a conventional phase, a period of non-nuclear combat before the threshold of atomic war was crossed, was largely absent from the thinking of the period. This had profound consequences for how the military and the government thought about deterrence, about crisis management, about the relationship between political decisions and military operations. The bomb was not a weapon of last resort. It was the weapon of first resort, and everything else was built around that fact. The Strategic Air Command, which came to dominate American military thinking through much of the 1950s, was the institutional expression of this concept. SAC was not simply a branch of the Air Force. It was a quasi-independent military organization with its own culture, its own doctrine, its own intelligence apparatus, and an extraordinary degree of operational autonomy. Under the command of General Curtis LeMay, SAC developed into a force whose entire purpose was the rapid delivery of nuclear weapons on Soviet targets. LeMay was a man of extraordinary operational competence and extraordinary rigidity of thought, and the culture he created within SAC reflected both of those qualities. SAC personnel flew more hours, trained harder, and maintained higher standards of technical proficiency than any comparable military force in the world. They were also developing, largely without external oversight, a target list and an operational concept that would have struck most Americans as deeply alarming if they had known about it. The Single Integrated Operational Plan, which became the formal name for the American Nuclear War Plan in 1960, called for the simultaneous delivery of thousands of nuclear warheads against the Soviet Union, China, and their allies. The original version of the plan, as it was briefed to civilian officials in the Kennedy administration, envisioned casualties on the order of several 100 million people in the Soviet Union and China alone, with additional casualties in Eastern Europe and potentially in Western Europe and the United States, depending on how the Soviet response unfolded. When Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara was briefed on the plan shortly after taking office, he reportedly left the room looking ill. The plan had been developed in substantial isolation from civilian oversight, and it reflected the institutional priorities of the military organizations that created it, rather than any coherent political strategy. The Kennedy administration spent considerable energy trying to introduce flexibility into American nuclear war planning, trying to create options between doing nothing and launching everything. This effort produced real changes in official doctrine, but it did not fundamentally alter the underlying architecture. The weapons existed. The command and control systems existed. The targeting databases existed. The institutional culture of SAC existed. You could write new doctrine, but changing the actual operational reality was a slower and more difficult process. And in the meantime, the world kept producing crises that tested the systems in ways that their designers had not fully anticipated. The Berlin crises of 1948 and 1961 were early demonstrations of how the nuclear standoff would shape conventional political conflicts. In both cases, the Soviet Union was applying pressure to a Western position that was genuinely difficult to defend by conventional military means. West Berlin was surrounded by Soviet forces and accessible from the west only through corridors that ran through East German territory. If the Soviets chose to close those corridors, the Western powers could not open them by force without initiating a level of conventional conflict that might rapidly escalate to nuclear war. This reality gave the Soviet leadership a degree of leverage that went far beyond the specific question of Berlin. It demonstrated that the existence of nuclear weapons created a kind of strategic immunity for certain categories of Soviet action. The West could not respond conventionally to actions taken in the shadow of Soviet nuclear capability without risking escalation, and it could not escalate to nuclear use without accepting the destruction of its own civilization. This logic was understood on both sides, and it produced a kind of stability that was real, but deeply uncomfortable. The stability was real because neither side wanted nuclear war, and both sides understood the consequences of initiating it. It was uncomfortable because it meant that a great deal of Soviet behavior that the West found threatening or destabilizing could not be effectively countered without crossing a threshold that no one wanted to cross. The result was a pattern of accommodation and managed confrontation that continued for decades and that produced its own pathologies. Each side learned to probe the other's tolerances, to apply pressure in ways that stopped short of triggering nuclear response, to exploit the gap between what the other side found unacceptable and what it was actually willing to go to war over. The Korean War was the first major test of this dynamic in actual combat. When North Korea invaded the South in June of 1950, the Truman administration faced a genuine question about whether to use nuclear weapons. American conventional forces were in serious difficulty during the early months of the war, and the temptation to reach for the ultimate weapon was real. MacArthur requested authority to use atomic bombs against Chinese targets after China entered the war. Truman refused, and his refusal established a precedent that would prove enormously consequential. Nuclear weapons would not be used in a limited war, even a war that was going badly. The political and diplomatic costs of crossing that threshold were too high, and the risk of escalation was too real. This decision was not popular with everyone in the military, and it contributed to the tensions between Truman and MacArthur that ultimately led to MacArthur's dismissal. But it established a line that, once established, proved remarkably durable. The durability of that line was not something that could be taken for granted. There were multiple occasions during the Cold War when nuclear weapons came very close to being used, and not all of those occasions involved the deliberate decisions of national leaders. Some of them involved accidents, some of them involved miscommunication, some of them involved automated systems that were designed to function without waiting for human authorization, and that nearly functioned exactly as designed in circumstances where the actual context was very different from what the systems had been designed to respond to. The history of these near misses is not fully known even now, because many of the relevant documents remain classified and some of what happened was never written down at all. But enough has emerged from declassified materials and from the accounts of participants to paint a picture that is considerably more alarming than the official narrative of successful deterrence would suggest. The problem of nuclear accidents was recognized early. As the United States began deploying nuclear weapons on aircraft, on missiles, on submarines, and in storage facilities around the world, the possibility that one of those weapons might detonate accidentally or be detonated by error became a real operational concern. The weapons of the early period were, by modern standards, remarkably insecure. The earliest atomic bombs had no electronic locks, no coded authorization requirements, no safeguards against unauthorized use. They could, in principle, be armed and detonated by anyone with access to them and the technical knowledge to operate the firing mechanism. The military argued, not without reason, that complex safeguards would degrade the reliability of the weapons and slow their deployment in a crisis. The civilian leadership argued that weapons that could be used without authorization were a serious danger. This argument went on for years, with significant practical consequences. In January of 1961, a B-52 bomber carrying two Mark 39 hydrogen bombs broke apart over Goldsboro, North Carolina. The aircraft experienced a structural failure during a routine flight, and both weapons fell to the ground. One of them, as it fell, went through several of the steps required to arm itself. Multiple safety switches closed in the correct sequence. The weapon came very close to completing the arming process. A subsequent investigation found that only a single switch, a low-voltage switch that happened to be in the safe position, had prevented the weapon from detonating. The yield of each weapon was approximately 4 megatons, or roughly 260 times the yield of the bomb that destroyed Hiroshima. If the weapon had detonated, the explosion would have been felt hundreds of miles away and would have irradiated a significant portion of the eastern United States. The response to the Goldsboro incident within the government was not panic. It was bureaucratic. Procedures were reviewed, recommendations were made, some changes were implemented. The incident was classified, not disclosed to the public, and absorbed into the institutional memory of the organizations involved as a data point in the ongoing process of improving nuclear safety. This response was characteristic of how nuclear accidents and near misses were handled throughout the Cold War. The information was contained, the implications were managed administratively, and the public narrative of a controlled and carefully managed deterrent was maintained. The people doing this were not cynical. They genuinely believed that public knowledge of these incidents would create more danger than it prevented, by generating panic, by giving adversaries information about American vulnerabilities, by undermining confidence in the deterrent. They may have been right about some of that, but the effect was also to insulate the nuclear enterprise from the kind of democratic scrutiny that might have changed its direction. The Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962 is the most extensively studied episode in Cold War history, and for good reason. It was the closest the world came to nuclear war during the entire Cold War period, and the way it was resolved, and the way it almost was not resolved, reveals a great deal about how nuclear deterrence actually functions under real conditions as opposed to theoretical ones. The basic outline of the crisis is well known. The Soviet Union secretly deployed medium-range and intermediate-range ballistic missiles to Cuba. American reconnaissance flights discovered the deployments before they were complete. The Kennedy administration decided to demand the withdrawal of the missiles and to enforce that demand with a naval blockade. The Soviets initially refused to acknowledge the deployments and then refused to remove the missiles. For 13 days, the two most powerful military forces in history stood at the edge of a conflict that both sides knew could end in the annihilation of much of the inhabited world. What is less well known about the Cuban Missile Crisis is how many points of failure there were, how many moments when events could have gone in a very different direction, how many decisions were made on incomplete information or under time pressure that precluded careful deliberation. On October 27, 1962, a day that some of the participants later described as the day they were most certain they were going to die, several things happened simultaneously that came very close to triggering a military exchange. An American U-2 reconnaissance aircraft strayed into Soviet airspace over Siberia due to a navigation error, and Soviet fighters scrambled to intercept it. American fighters armed with nuclear air-to-air missiles were dispatched to escort the U-2 back to friendly territory, creating an armed confrontation near Soviet territory at exactly the moment of maximum tension in the missile crisis. On the other side of the world, another American U-2 was shot down over Cuba by a Soviet surface-to-air missile battery. The decision to fire was made by Soviet commanders on the ground in Cuba without authorization from Moscow, acting on standing orders that had been issued earlier and not updated to reflect the rapidly changing diplomatic situation. And beneath the surface of the Caribbean, a Soviet submarine designated B-59 had lost contact with Moscow and was under attack by American naval forces, using depth charges that the submarine's crew could not distinguish from actual weapons. The submarine had been out of communication for days. The crew did not know whether war had broken out. The captain and the political officer both believed that the depth charges might represent the beginning of a real attack. The submarine was carrying a nuclear torpedo. Under Soviet naval doctrine, the captain had authority to use that torpedo without receiving specific authorization from Moscow. The captain wanted to launch. The political officer agreed. The authorization of a third officer, the flotilla commander Vasily Arkhipov, who happened to be aboard, was required under the specific protocols that applied to this particular vessel. Arkhipov refused to authorize the launch. He argued that they should surface and attempt to re-establish contact with Moscow before taking any irreversible action. His argument prevailed. The submarine surfaced. Contact was eventually re-established. The crisis was resolved. The outcome of the Cuban Missile Crisis depended, in a meaningful and literal sense, on the personal judgment of Vasily Arkhipov, a Soviet naval officer whose name was not widely known until decades after the events in question. The elaborate systems of deterrence, the carefully calibrated calculations of mutual assured destruction, the sophisticated command and control architectures that both superpowers had spent billions of dollars developing, all of it came down to whether one man on one submarine in the Caribbean Sea was willing to say no. That is not a comfortable conclusion to draw from the most dangerous episode in the history of nuclear confrontation, but it is an accurate one. The lesson that American and Soviet planners drew from the Cuban Missile Crisis was largely the correct one, that better communication between the two capitals was essential to managing future crises. The direct telephone link between Washington and Moscow, popularly but inaccurately known as the hotline, was established in 1963 as a direct result of the crisis. The actual hotline was not a telephone but a teletype system, chosen because voice communication was considered too susceptible to misinterpretation, because the nuances of tone and stress in a spoken message might create misunderstandings at exactly the moments when clarity was most essential. The teletype system was slower and less convenient, but it was more reliable and more precise. Later, it was upgraded to use satellite links and eventually fax machines, and then digital communication. The existence of the hotline was a genuine improvement in crisis management. It also represented an acknowledgement that the existing systems were inadequate, which was true, but it did not address the more fundamental problem, which was that the two sides were locked in a structural relationship that created crises faster than communication systems could resolve them. The years following the Cuban Missile Crisis saw a gradual formalization of the rules by which the two superpowers managed their competition. Arms control negotiations began in earnest, producing a series of agreements that limited certain categories of weapons, prohibited nuclear tests in certain environments, and established verification mechanisms that allowed each side to monitor the other's compliance with at least some of the constraints they had agreed to. The Limited Test Ban Treaty of 1963 ended atmospheric nuclear testing, which had been generating increasing public concern about radioactive fallout. The Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty of 1968 attempted to limit the spread of nuclear weapons to additional states. The Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, which began in 1969 and produced the first SALT agreement in 1972, placed numerical limits on certain categories of strategic nuclear systems for the first time. These agreements were real achievements, and they reflected genuine recognition on both sides that the arms race had its own momentum, and that without active management it would continue to escalate in ways that neither side could fully control or afford. But they also had significant limitations. They regulated numbers without addressing the underlying strategic logic that drove the accumulation of weapons in the first place. They placed ceilings on what existed, but did not require actual reductions in existing arsenals for many years. They created verification mechanisms that were imperfect, and that were frequently tested and sometimes violated. And they left entirely untouched many of the most dangerous aspects of nuclear competition, including the development of multiple independently targetable warheads that allowed a single missile to destroy multiple targets. The deployment of ballistic missile submarines that were essentially invulnerable to preemptive attack and that therefore guaranteed a retaliatory capability regardless of what happened in a first strike. And the continuing refinement of targeting accuracy that gradually made it theoretically possible to contemplate actually winning a nuclear exchange rather than simply surviving one. The concept of winning a nuclear war was not a fringe idea in American military planning. It was a serious operational concept that drove weapons development and targeting doctrine throughout the 1970s and into the 1980s. The argument was not entirely irrational. If deterrence failed, if nuclear war actually broke out, then it was better to have weapons capable of destroying the adversary's nuclear forces before they could be launched than to simply absorb a first strike and retaliate against cities. The problem with this logic was that from the other side, the development of highly accurate, first strike-capable weapons looked exactly like preparation for a surprise attack. It looked like the preparation of a capability to disarm the other side in a sudden, massive strike before they could respond. The Soviet response to American development of accurate counter-force weapons was to develop their own, and to develop launch-on-warning systems that would allow their missiles to be fired in the minutes between detecting an incoming attack and the incoming warheads actually arriving. This made the overall situation significantly more dangerous, because it meant that a false alarm, a technical malfunction, a misinterpreted radar return, could trigger an actual nuclear launch before anyone had time to determine whether the alarm was genuine. The Soviet early warning system experienced exactly such a false alarm in September of 1983. On the night of September 26th, the duty officer at a Soviet early warning facility named Serpukhov 15, a lieutenant colonel named Stanislav Petrov, observed what appeared to be a launch warning from the American Minuteman missile system. The automated system reported that 5 intercontinental ballistic missiles had been launched from the United States and were on trajectories toward the Soviet Union. The protocols required Petrov to report the warning up the chain of command immediately, which would have initiated a response process. Petrov did not immediately report the warning. He assessed the situation and concluded, based on several factors including the implausibility of an American first strike consisting of only 5 missiles, that the warning was likely a false alarm. He was right. The warning was caused by a malfunction in the Soviet satellite system, which had confused the reflection of sunlight off high-altitude clouds for rocket exhaust. The satellites had been designed and deployed knowing that this kind of false alarm was possible, but the specifics of how the malfunction would manifest had not been fully anticipated. Petrov's decision not to immediately report the warning up the chain of command violated his formal duty. He was supposed to report what the system told him, not evaluate it. The rationale for that protocol was sound. In the actual minutes of a real nuclear attack, there would be no time for individual officers to make their own assessments. The response system was designed to function quickly and automatically precisely because human deliberation was too slow. By deciding to assess rather than report, Petrov was exercising a kind of unauthorized judgment that the system had been deliberately designed to exclude. He was right to exercise it in this particular instance because the system was wrong. But the fact that the outcome was good does not mean the decision was consistent with the system's design. The system was designed to remove individual human judgment from the loop. Petrov put it back in, and that is why the world did not end on September 26, 1983. The Petrov incident was not made public for many years. It was investigated internally by Soviet authorities, and Petrov was eventually reprimanded, not for any action he took during the incident, but for irregularities in his paperwork for the records he kept that night. He was never officially recognized or rewarded for what he did. The incident became known in the West only in the mid-1990s, when declassified materials and Petrov's own accounts began to emerge. By that time, the Soviet Union no longer existed, and the operational details of its early warning system were no longer quite as sensitive as they had been. But the underlying issue, the question of how nuclear command and control systems handle false alarms, and what happens when the automated systems and the human operators in them disagree, remained unresolved. The year 1983 was in many ways the most dangerous year of the Cold War after 1962. And it is less well remembered than it deserves to be. In March of that year, President Reagan announced the Strategic Defense Initiative, a program to develop a system capable of intercepting incoming ballistic missiles and rendering nuclear weapons, in his phrase, impotent and obsolete. The Soviet leadership's response to this announcement was not what American officials expected. Rather than dismissing it as technically implausible or negotiating to prevent its development, the Soviet leadership interpreted SDI as a potential first strike enabler. If the United States could develop a system that would intercept Soviet retaliatory missiles after an American first strike, then the American ability to threaten a disarming first strike and survive the reduced Soviet response would be significantly enhanced. From this perspective, SDI was not a defensive system. It was a component of a first strike strategy. The Soviet leadership began seriously to consider whether the United States was preparing for an actual surprise nuclear attack. This concern was not irrational given the totality of what was happening in 1983. In addition to SDI, the United States was deploying Pershing II intermediate-range ballistic missiles in Western Europe, missiles with very short flight times to Soviet territory, missiles that the Soviets regarded as potential first-strike weapons given their accuracy and speed. American military exercises were becoming increasingly aggressive in their simulations, with scenarios that included nuclear strikes. American naval forces were conducting operations near Soviet territory, testing Soviet defenses, and demonstrating the ability to penetrate Soviet defensive perimeters. And the rhetoric coming from American political leadership was more confrontational than anything the Soviets had heard since the early days of the nuclear age. In this context, the Soviet intelligence agencies launched an operation designated Ryan, for the Russian phrase meaning nuclear missile attack, to monitor indicators that the United States might be preparing a surprise nuclear strike. Ryan collectors were instructed to watch for specific signs, including unusual activity at military installations, changes in the activity patterns of government officials, shifts in the readiness status of nuclear forces, anything that might indicate that preparations for an attack were underway. This program was not publicly known at the time. It was revealed only after the Cold War ended, but its existence tells you something important about the state of Soviet thinking in 1983. The leadership of the Soviet Union, the collective leadership of a nuclear superpower, genuinely believed that the United States might be planning a surprise nuclear attack. That belief affected their decisions. It affected what they watched for, what they were prepared to respond to, and how quickly they might respond. In November of 1983, NATO conducted a large-scale command post exercise called Able Archer 83. The exercise was designed to practice the procedures for transitioning from conventional to nuclear war, and it was unusually realistic in several respects. It used a new communications format that Soviet intelligence had not seen before. It involved senior political figures in ways that previous exercises had not. Soviet intelligence monitoring of the exercise became convinced, at least at some level of the Soviet apparatus, that the exercise might be cover for an actual attack. Soviet nuclear forces in Eastern Europe were placed on higher alert. Soviet aircraft were loaded with nuclear weapons and held at readiness. The Soviet leadership was receiving intelligence reports suggesting that NATO might be moving toward an actual strike. American intelligence was aware of some of the Soviet response to Able Archer, though not all of it. A British intelligence asset inside the KGB provided information that indicated the Soviets were genuinely alarmed. When this information was shared with the Reagan administration, the response was not what might be expected. Reagan, who had previously spoken of the Soviet Union as an evil empire, and who had authorized SDI and supported the deployment of Pershing IIs, and had generally taken a confrontational posture toward the Soviet government, was apparently genuinely surprised to learn that the Soviets might believe a nuclear attack was coming. He subsequently wrote in his diary that he had been troubled to realize that the Soviets were genuinely frightened, that they believed the rhetoric he had been using, and that he had not fully understood the implications of how American actions and statements were being received in Moscow. This realization contributed to a shift in his approach to Soviet relations that, in retrospect, was consequential. But it had come very close to never mattering, because the crisis of November 1983 had come very close to something much worse. What is remarkable about all of these near misses is not that they occurred, but that they did not produce the outcome they were capable of producing. The systems that were built to manage nuclear deterrence were not nearly as reliable as their designers believed. The human beings operating those systems were not nearly as predictable as the theoretical models assumed. The information available to decision-makers at critical moments was never complete and was frequently wrong. The time available for deliberation was always shorter than anyone wanted, and in some scenarios, it was essentially non-existent. The fact that these deficiencies did not result in nuclear war is not, on careful examination, primarily a testament to the wisdom of the people involved. It is a testament to coincidence, to the fortunate alignment of circumstances that happen to produce the right outcome in situations where a slightly different alignment would have produced catastrophe. The arms control process that developed during the 1970s and continued into the 1980s eventually produced the most significant nuclear reductions of the Cold War period. The Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty of 1987 and the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty of 1991. These agreements required the actual elimination of entire categories of weapons and represented genuine progress. But the process of negotiating them revealed something important about the relationship between arms control and security. The negotiations were enormously time-consuming, technically complex, and politically contentious. They required enormous diplomatic effort and political capital. And the result, even after all of that effort, was an agreement that left both sides with thousands of strategic nuclear weapons, enough to destroy civilization several times over. The reduction from absurd levels of overkill to somewhat less absurd levels of overkill was an achievement. But it was an achievement that required acknowledging how far the situation had drifted from anything that a rational actor would have designed deliberately. The question of command and control, of who actually had authority to order nuclear weapons to be used, was one that neither superpower fully resolved during the Cold War. The American system in theory required presidential authorization for the use of nuclear weapons, but the operational reality was considerably more complicated. Procedures for nuclear use in the absence of presidential authority were developed and maintained throughout the Cold War, because planners recognized that a decapitating first strike might eliminate the president and other senior officials before they could issue launch orders, and that a nuclear force unable to retaliate because its chain of command had been destroyed was not a credible deterrent. The result was a system with significant delegation of authority to military commanders in certain circumstances, a system where the formal requirement for presidential authorization coexisted with operational procedures that would allow nuclear use without it. The Soviet system was even more complicated. The Soviets developed a semi-automated system known in the West by the name given to it by analysts who learned of it, dead hand or perimeter, designed to ensure that the Soviet Union could retaliate even if its entire political and military leadership had been killed in a first strike. The details of how this system worked remained secret for many years, and some details remain uncertain. But the basic concept was that a system of sensors monitoring for indicators of nuclear attack would, under certain conditions, automatically authorize the transmission of launch commands to ballistic missile forces without requiring human decision. The system was not fully automated in the sense of requiring no human action whatsoever. There were human operators involved, specifically duty officers in hardened command facilities who would be required to initiate the launch sequence if the conditions for automatic authorization were met. But the decision was not their decision. Their function was to observe that the conditions had been met and to transmit the launch authorization. Whether they agreed with the decision, whether they believed the situation warranted launch, was not operationally relevant. The system had already decided. The existence of a dead-hand type system raises profound questions about the relationship between deterrence and human agency. Deterrence theory is built on the premise that nuclear forces exist to influence the decisions of rational adversaries, to convince them that the costs of aggression outweigh the potential gains. This requires that the threatened retaliation be a genuine decision, made by human beings who are actually evaluating the situation and choosing to respond. A fully automated or semi-automated retaliation system removes the decision from human hands. It ensures retaliation regardless of any human judgment about whether retaliation is appropriate. This may actually strengthen deterrence in a technical sense because it makes the threat more credible. But it also means that the system can retaliate in circumstances where a human decision-maker, if consulted, might conclude that retaliation was not appropriate, that the attack was accidental, or that a ceasefire was being negotiated, or that the situation was ambiguous in ways that warranted delay. A system designed to function without human judgment will function without human judgment even when human judgment would say no. The development of ballistic missile submarines changed the strategic calculus of nuclear deterrence in ways that are still not fully appreciated. Before submarines carrying nuclear missiles became operational in the early 1960s, the nuclear forces of both superpowers were, in theory, vulnerable to a sufficiently large and accurate first strike. Land-based missiles and bombers at airfields could be identified, targeted, and in principle destroyed before they could be launched. This vulnerability created a dangerous incentive. If you believed the other side might be preparing a first strike, you might be tempted to launch your own weapons first to avoid losing them. The submarine-based deterrent eliminated this problem for the side that possessed it, because submarines at sea could not be reliably located or destroyed. An adversary who launched a first strike would still face massive retaliation from the submarines, making the first strike pointless. This was, in theory, stabilizing. It removed the use-it-or-lose-it pressure that had made land-based forces in silos a source of instability. But submarines introduced their own complications. Communication with submarines is technically difficult, because submarines must be near the surface to receive radio transmissions, and being near the surface makes them detectable. Deep ocean submarines operating under wartime conditions might be out of communication for extended periods. In those periods, the submarine commander's only guidance was standing orders and his own assessment of the situation. The submarine was carrying thermonuclear weapons of enormous destructive power, and the person with the most direct control over those weapons was a naval officer who might not have received any new instructions for days or weeks. This was not a hypothetical concern. It was an operational reality throughout the Cold War. The American submarine force had procedures designed to manage this problem. Nuclear weapons on submarines required authorization codes that had to be received from higher authority, and the submarine's operating instructions specified the conditions under which they could be used. But those procedures had gaps, and the gaps were known to the people who designed them. There were scenarios in which the procedures would break down, in which the submarine commander would have to exercise his own judgment about whether to use his weapons. Those scenarios were classified and discussed only internally, but they existed. The problem of nuclear command and control was not limited to submarines. The land-based missile forces faced their own version of the problem. Minuteman missile crews sat in underground command capsules with the physical capability to launch their weapons, but under normal procedures they required authorization codes transmitted from higher authority before they could do so. What happened if those codes never came because higher authority had been destroyed? What happened if the codes came but the crew had reason to doubt their authenticity? What happened if 2 of the 4 officers required to complete a launch procedure refused to turn their keys because they believed the order was not genuine? These were questions that the procedures addressed in various ways, and the answers evolved over time, but they were never fully resolved. The fundamental tension between the need for centralized control and the need for assured retaliation could not be resolved through procedures alone. The policy of launch on warning, which both the United States and the Soviet Union maintained in various forms throughout much of the Cold War, represented the most acute version of this tension. Launch on warning meant that nuclear forces could be launched after detecting an incoming attack, but before the incoming warheads arrived. The rationale was that this prevented the loss of the entire land-based force to a first strike and therefore preserved the retaliatory deterrent. The problem was that launch on warning required a decision to be made in approximately 15 minutes, the flight time of a submarine-launched ballistic missile from a launch point near the American coast. In that 15 minutes, decision-makers had to receive the warning, assess its reliability, determine that it was real, make the political decision to retaliate, and transmit the launch orders to the forces. 15 minutes is not very long. It is long enough to transmit an order. It is not reliably long enough to determine whether the order should be given. In November of 1979, A training tape containing a simulated nuclear attack scenario was accidentally loaded into the computers of the North American Aerospace Defense Command, producing warnings of a massive Soviet missile attack. The duty officer who received the warning called it in as a possible mass attack. Fighter aircraft were scrambled. Missile launch crews received preliminary warnings. The alert lasted approximately 6 minutes before it was determined that the warning was false. 6 minutes is not very long, but in the context of a launch on warning policy, 6 minutes is the difference between a false alarm that is corrected and a false alarm that produces an actual nuclear launch. The NORAD false alarm of 1979 was followed in June of 1980 by another false alarm from the same system, caused this time by a faulty integrated circuit that cost 46 cents, and that caused the system to display attack warnings intermittently over a period of several hours. The faulty chip was eventually identified and replaced, but the incident raised serious questions about the reliability of the early warning system and about what would happen during an actual crisis, when the people receiving ambiguous warning data would be operating under enormous pressure and with far less time to determine whether the alarms were real. These technical failures in the American system were paralleled by similar failures in the Soviet system. The Soviet early warning infrastructure was in many respects less reliable than the American one, and the organizational culture of the Soviet military made it harder to report and address problems. Officers who reported that a system was malfunctioning were sometimes treated as though they were questioning the competence of the people who built it, which in a hierarchical military bureaucracy could have serious professional consequences. The result was that problems were sometimes minimized or delayed in reporting in ways that created additional risk. The nuclear weapons themselves, apart from the command and control systems, were also sources of risk in ways that were not always fully understood at the time. The early nuclear weapons were large, heavy, complex devices that required careful handling and that had failure modes which were not well characterized. As the weapons were refined and miniaturized, they became more portable and more numerous, but they also became in some respects more complex in their safety characteristics. A weapon that has multiple arming sequences and safety devices designed to prevent unauthorized detonation may fail in ways that the safety devices do not anticipate. Several incidents during the Cold War involved nuclear weapons that were damaged or nearly detonated in ways that the safety analysis had not predicted. The 1966 Palomares incident is one example. A B-52 bomber collided with a KC-135 tanker aircraft during an aerial refueling operation over the coast of Spain. The B-52 was carrying 4 hydrogen bombs. 2 of the bombs fell on land near the town of Palomares, and 2 fell into the Mediterranean Sea. The bombs that fell on land scattered plutonium contamination over a significant area when their conventional explosive detonators partially detonated, which was not a nuclear explosion, but was a serious radiological incident that required extensive cleanup. One of the bombs that fell into the sea was lost for nearly 3 months before being recovered. The operation to recover it involved significant diplomatic complications with Spain, and the incident became publicly known in a way that many such incidents did not, because it was too large to conceal. The 1968 Thule Air Base accident in Greenland was similar in some respects. A B-52 on airborne alert caught fire and crashed on the ice near Thule. The aircraft was carrying 4 hydrogen bombs. All 4 weapons were destroyed in the fire and subsequent explosion of conventional explosives, scattering plutonium and highly enriched uranium across a large area of the ice cap. The cleanup operation was extensive, conducted in Arctic conditions, and involved thousands of personnel. One of the bomb capsules was never recovered. The incident was classified for many years. The pattern across these incidents is consistent. A nuclear weapon or nuclear material is involved in an accident. The accident is investigated. The investigation identifies contributing factors and recommends corrective actions. The corrective actions are implemented. The incident is classified. Life goes on. The institutional response is always professional, and the improvements that result from it are genuine. But the cumulative effect of the pattern is to demonstrate that the nuclear enterprise is regularly generating accidents and near accidents of a severity that would, if they were not nuclear in nature, be considered catastrophic. The accidents are being managed, but management is not the same as prevention, and prevention was not fully achievable given the scale and complexity of the enterprise. The nuclear testing programs of both superpowers during the Cold War constituted their own form of environmental catastrophe, largely invisible to the publics of the countries conducting the tests and to the populations living downwind of the test sites. American nuclear testing in the Nevada desert and in the Pacific Ocean generated radioactive contamination that affected large numbers of people. The residents of areas downwind of the Nevada test site, a population that came to be known as the downwinders, were exposed to radioactive fallout from atmospheric tests conducted in the 1950s and early 1960s. Studies conducted decades later found elevated rates of certain cancers in these populations. The government's response to early evidence of these health effects was to minimize them, to dispute the causal link, and to continue the testing program. The Marshall Islands, where American testing was concentrated in the Pacific, were contaminated by nuclear tests in ways that affected the health and culture of the indigenous population profoundly and permanently. The Bikini Atoll tests, including the Castle Bravo test of 1954, which produced a yield of 15 megatons, nearly 3 times the design estimate, spread radioactive fallout over a vast area of the Pacific, affecting the crew of a Japanese fishing vessel, the Lucky Dragon, whose exposure and subsequent illness brought international attention to the issue of radioactive fallout from nuclear testing for the first time. Soviet nuclear testing at the Semipalatinsk test site in Kazakhstan, which was the primary Soviet testing ground for 40 years, contaminated an area of roughly 140,000 square kilometers and affected a regional population estimated at over 1 million people. Health effects in the affected population included elevated rates of cancer, genetic abnormalities, and other conditions. The Soviet government conducted some medical monitoring of the affected population, but the results were classified and the affected people were not informed. In some cases, they were not evacuated even when tests were scheduled, and their proximity to the test site was known. The nuclear testing programs of both superpowers were thus not only weapons development activities, they were also in effect public health experiments conducted on uninformed populations without their consent. The scientific information gained from the tests was real and important for weapons design and for understanding nuclear effects. The health consequences to the affected populations were also real and important, but they were classified rather than disclosed, minimized rather than acknowledged, and compensated only reluctantly and incompletely many years after the fact. The development of thermonuclear weapons, hydrogen bombs using fusion reactions to achieve yields many times greater than the fission bombs of the first generation, transformed the strategic situation in ways that were not fully grasped even by the scientists and military planners involved in the programs. A fission bomb of the Hiroshima type destroys a city. A thermonuclear bomb of the type developed in the 1950s destroys not just a city, but the entire metropolitan area around it. A single warhead of the type that went into mass production could eliminate every living thing in a circle many miles in diameter. When both superpowers had accumulated thousands of such weapons, the concept of nuclear war as a military operation, as a conflict with objectives and strategies and operational art, began to lose coherence. There was no military objective that required the destruction of every city on Earth, but the weapons existed in quantities that, if used, would destroy every city on Earth. The strategy, therefore, became not about how to fight a nuclear war, but about how to convince the other side that you were prepared to fight one, whether or not that was actually true. This performative aspect of nuclear deterrence, the importance of appearing willing to do something you might not actually be willing to do, created its own pathologies. Military forces had to be maintained in states of readiness that served deterrence, even if they did not serve actual operational requirements. Statements had to be made about capabilities and intentions that were designed for their effect on an adversary's calculations rather than their accuracy. Exercises had to be conducted and demonstrations made that served the purpose of signaling resolve. The entire apparatus of deterrence was partly a management system for actual weapons and partly a theater of credibility, a continuous performance intended to convince the other side that you were serious, that you would actually do the terrible things you were threatening to do. The people conducting this performance were aware, at some level, of the gap between the performance and the reality. Senior military officers and civilian officials who had actually thought through what nuclear war would mean did not believe that nuclear war was winnable in any meaningful sense. But they could not say that, because saying it would undermine deterrence. So they maintained the performance, and over time the performance became, in some respects, its own reality, because the systems that were built to support it were real systems with real capabilities and real operational momentum. The concept of flexible response, which NATO adopted in 1967 as its official nuclear strategy, was in part an attempt to make the nuclear deterrent more credible by making it less extreme. Massive retaliation, the earlier doctrine, threatened nuclear response to virtually any Soviet military action. Flexible response introduced the idea that nuclear weapons might be used in a limited way in response to conventional aggression, matching the level of force used by the adversary. This was intended to make the threat of nuclear use more believable, because it was more graduated. But it also introduced the question of how escalation would be controlled once nuclear weapons had been used, even in small numbers. The analysts who had thought about this question most carefully were not confident that escalation could be controlled once the nuclear threshold was crossed. Once a nuclear weapon exploded in a combat zone, the pressure on both sides to escalate, to use more weapons before the adversary did, would be enormous. The concept of limited nuclear war was, in the view of many serious analysts, internally incoherent. But it remained NATO doctrine because the alternatives were either to threaten massive nuclear response to anything, which was not credible, or to rely entirely on conventional defense, which was expensive and which the Europeans were not willing to pay for. The deployment of tactical nuclear weapons, short-range battlefield weapons designed for use against military forces rather than cities, was one of the most destabilizing aspects of Cold War military preparation, and one of the least discussed. At the peak of their deployment, American forces alone had approximately 7,000 tactical nuclear weapons in Europe, including artillery shells, short-range missiles, landmines, depth charges, and air-delivered bombs. These weapons were dispersed throughout the NATO forces, some of them co-located with conventional military units that would be involved in the early stages of a conventional conflict. They were under the command of unit commanders who might, under certain scenarios, have authority to use them without waiting for authorization from higher levels of the chain of command. The Soviets had comparable deployments. The result was that the European theater was saturated with nuclear weapons at levels that made the idea of a clean conventional phase of any major European conflict essentially implausible. Any large-scale NATO-Warsaw Pact conventional conflict would involve forces that were surrounded by nuclear weapons, and the pressure to use those weapons in situations where conventional operations were going badly would be intense. The decision to deploy neutron bombs, enhanced radiation weapons designed to maximize the lethal radiation effect relative to the blast effect, in Europe in the late 1970s, generated enormous public controversy. The weapons were designed to kill personnel with minimal damage to structures, which their advocates argued made them better suited to battlefield use because they would not destroy the territory being defended. Their opponents argued that any weapon that made nuclear use seem more acceptable was profoundly dangerous, regardless of its specific characteristics. The neutron bomb debate was one of the few instances during the Cold War when the details of nuclear strategy became a matter of genuine public controversy, and the controversy revealed how little the public understood about the actual state of nuclear deployment in Europe and how differently they would have reacted if they had known. The intelligence competition that ran alongside the military competition during the Cold War was in many ways as consequential as the weapons programs themselves, and it generated its own set of near catastrophes. The U-2 reconnaissance program, which flew aircraft over Soviet territory at altitudes American planners believed were beyond the reach of Soviet air defenses, was producing intelligence that was genuinely transformative in its value. The photographs taken by U-2 overflights of the Soviet Union showed the actual state of Soviet military infrastructure in a way that no other intelligence source could approach. They revealed that the missile gap, the supposed American vulnerability to Soviet strategic advantage that was a major political issue in the late 1950s, was essentially fictional. The Soviet strategic missile force was far smaller and less developed than American intelligence had estimated. But the U-2 program was living on borrowed time. The Soviets knew the overflights were occurring because their radar systems tracked the aircraft even if they could not reach it. They were working on surface-to-air missiles capable of reaching the U-2's altitude. American planners were aware that this development was coming. The decision to continue the overflights as the Soviet capability was approaching was made at senior levels with awareness of the risk. When Francis Gary Powers was shot down over Sverdlovsk in May of 1960, the incident destroyed a planned summit between Eisenhower and Khrushchev and contributed to one of the most serious deteriorations in superpower relations of the late 1950s. But it had been a predictable outcome of a calculated risk, not a bolt from the blue. The intelligence failures of the Cold War were as consequential as the intelligence successes. American estimates of Soviet military capability were systematically distorted by several factors, including the incentive structures within the intelligence community that rewarded finding threats rather than minimizing them, the genuine difficulty of assessing capabilities of a closed society from the outside, and the tendency of worst-case planning, which treated the most alarming possible interpretation of ambiguous evidence as the operational assumption. The result was that American policymakers and planners consistently overestimated Soviet military capability and underestimated Soviet economic and political fragility. This overestimation drove American military spending and weapons programs at levels that were in some respects unnecessary and that had their own costs, not just in dollars, but in the political and social consequences of maintaining a permanent war economy. The Soviet intelligence services faced different problems, but problems no less severe. Their assessment of American intentions was heavily influenced by ideological frameworks that led them to interpret American behavior in terms of capitalist aggression and imperial expansion, categories that were not always analytically helpful for understanding specific American decisions. They were also influenced by the experience of the Second World War, during which Western governments had failed to provide adequate warning of Hitler's invasion and which had left a deep institutional skepticism about the accuracy of intelligence assessments that minimized threats. The result was a tendency to take worst-case American intentions as the operating assumption, which in turn influenced military planning in ways that appeared threatening to the American side, completing a cycle of mutual threat inflation. The management of proxy conflicts, wars in which the superpowers supported opposing sides without directly engaging each other militarily, was one of the primary mechanisms by which the Cold War was conducted, and one of the primary sources of human suffering during the period. Korea, Vietnam, Angola, Mozambique, Ethiopia, Afghanistan, Central America. The list of conflicts in which superpower competition played a significant role is long, and the human cost of those conflicts was enormous. Millions of people died in wars that were in part expressions of a conflict between two nuclear powers that were not willing to risk direct confrontation with each other. The Cold War logic of avoiding direct superpower conflict was in this sense not a policy of peace. It was a policy of displacing conflict to parts of the world where it could be conducted without triggering nuclear escalation. Vietnam was the most traumatic American experience of this dynamic. The United States intervened in Vietnam to prevent a communist takeover that it believed would alter the strategic balance in Southeast Asia. a belief that in retrospect significantly overestimated the importance of Vietnam to the overall strategic situation and significantly underestimated the determination and capability of the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces. The escalation of American involvement followed a logic that seemed defensible at each step, but that produced in aggregate an outcome that was strategically and morally disastrous. More than 50,000 Americans died. Vietnamese casualties, military and civilian, were in the millions. The American military and political establishment was deeply divided and, in some respects, broken by the experience. The lesson that was drawn from Vietnam varied depending on who was drawing it. For some, it was that the United States had used insufficient force. For others, it was that the United States had used force in the wrong way, without a coherent political strategy. For others still, it was that the United States should be extremely cautious about military intervention in circumstances where the political context was not fully understood. Afghanistan, when it became the Soviet Union's equivalent of Vietnam beginning in 1979, produced a similar lesson for Moscow, drawn at comparable cost. The Soviet decision to intervene in Afghanistan to support a communist government that was failing to maintain control was made by a small group of elderly men who did not fully understand the military situation and who significantly underestimated both the difficulty of the task and the costs of failure. American support for the Afghan resistance, the Mujahideen, was a significant factor in the Soviet failure. The irony that this support would contribute to the development of the Taliban and to the conditions that produced September 11, 2001, was not foreseen at the time. Cold War decisions consistently produced second- and third-order consequences that their architects had not anticipated, because the Cold War framework simplified a complex world into a binary competition in ways that obscured the actual dynamics at work. The nuclear arms race had a specific economic dimension that was consequential for both superpowers, though in very different ways. The United States sustained an enormous defense establishment throughout the Cold War, spending amounts on military programs that constituted a significant fraction of its overall economic output. This spending had economic effects, some positive and some negative. It funded research and development in areas that produced important civilian technologies, including computing, communications, and aerospace. But it also diverted resources from other uses and created a defense industrial base that had its own political constituency and its own institutional interests in the continuation of the programs it was built to support. Eisenhower's farewell address, warning about the military-industrial complex, was not simply rhetorical. It was a description of a real structural problem that he had observed at close range. For the Soviet Union, the military burden was even more severe in relative terms. The Soviet economy was significantly smaller than the American one, but the Soviet military establishment was competing with the American one across essentially the same range of programs. Maintaining this competition required allocating a fraction of the Soviet economy to military purposes that crowded out investment in consumer goods, housing, infrastructure, and the civilian sectors that contributed to quality of life. Soviet citizens were aware, at some level, that they were living less well than they needed to in order to support a military establishment whose scale bore no obvious relationship to any realistic threat. This awareness contributed to the erosion of popular support for the Soviet system that was one of the factors in its eventual collapse. The human factor in nuclear deterrence was a persistent source of concern for the people who thought most carefully about nuclear strategy. The deterrence framework assumed rational actors making calculated decisions based on accurate information and coherent preferences. But the people actually operating the systems were not abstract rational actors. They were human beings with stress responses and cognitive biases and information gaps and organizational pressures that affected their judgment in ways that the theoretical framework did not model well. The psychiatric screening programs that the United States developed for personnel in nuclear roles, the Personnel Reliability Program, were designed to identify individuals who might pose a reliability risk. The program screened for mental illness, substance abuse, financial stress, and other indicators that might suggest a person was unreliable in a nuclear role. The problem with the personnel reliability program was not that it was poorly designed. It was that it was screening for the wrong risks. The risks that had actually materialized in Cold War nuclear incidents, the Petrov incident, the Goldsboro accident, the NORAD false alarms, were not caused by psychologically unstable individuals acting irrationally. They were caused by systems operating in ways that their designers had not fully anticipated, by information environments that presented decision-makers with ambiguous or incorrect inputs, by institutional pressures that created incentives to act quickly rather than carefully. A screening program that identified individuals with diagnosed psychiatric conditions was essentially irrelevant to these systemic risks. The development of satellite reconnaissance changed the intelligence picture dramatically and, in some respects, reduced the risk of war by removing the uncertainty that had contributed to worst-case planning. When both sides could monitor each other's military activities from space, the surprise attack scenarios that had dominated strategic thinking became less plausible. The Soviets could not secretly deploy a massive missile force without it being detected. The Americans could not concentrate conventional forces for an invasion without the Soviets seeing it. This transparency had stabilizing effects. It did not eliminate the risk of misinterpretation or of deliberate deception, but it significantly reduced the information gaps that had previously made catastrophic miscalculation more likely. But satellite reconnaissance also had a destabilizing dimension, because it provided each side with the ability to monitor the other's nuclear forces with sufficient precision to support targeting. You could identify where the missiles were, which meant you could target them. Improved targeting accuracy, combined with the ability to monitor target sets continuously, fed the counterforce strategies that made each side nervous about the survivability of its land-based forces. The surveillance technology that reduced uncertainty about overall military postures increased uncertainty about specific operational vulnerabilities, and those operational vulnerabilities drove the development of more accurate and faster weapons, which in turn increased the incentive to launch preemptively rather than absorb a first strike and retaliate. The arms control process was partly an attempt to manage these dynamics, but it was always running behind the technology. Agreements that limited the number of missiles did not limit the accuracy of the warheads on them. Agreements that limited certain delivery systems did not limit the development of new categories of systems that had not yet been deployed when the agreement was negotiated. The technology was always moving, and the diplomatic process was always slower than the technology. Each agreement that was reached was out of date in some respects by the time it was signed. The Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty of 1987, which eliminated an entire class of missiles from Europe, was a genuine achievement, but it was achieved partly because both sides had concluded by that point that the weapons in question were not strategically essential. The Pershing IIs and the Soviet SS-20s had been deployed partly in response to each other, in a cycle of action and reaction that had produced by 1987 a situation that neither side found strategically comfortable. Getting rid of them was possible because both sides believed they could maintain their essential deterrent posture without them. The elimination of weapons that neither side really needed was politically significant as a confidence-building measure, but it did not fundamentally alter the strategic balance or the underlying logic of deterrence. The period from the mid-1980s through the early 1990s saw changes that none of the Cold War's principal architects had anticipated and that most strategic analysts had not predicted. Mikhail Gorbachev's reforms, glasnost and perestroika, were intended to modernize and save the Soviet system, not to end it. His approach to arms control and to relations with the West was different in style and substance from that of his predecessors, more willing to accept verification regimes that previous Soviet leaders had resisted, more willing to acknowledge Soviet contributions to the tension of the Cold War, more focused on the domestic costs of the military competition. The series of summit meetings between Gorbachev and Reagan that began in Geneva in 1985 and culminated in the Malta summit of 1989 produced genuine changes in the relationship between the two countries, driven partly by personal chemistry and partly by the recognition on both sides that the costs of continuing the arms race at its current pace were not sustainable. The revolutions of 1989 in Eastern Europe, which swept away the communist governments of Poland, Hungary, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Romania and Bulgaria within a period of a few months, were not the direct result of military competition or strategic planning. They were the result of decades of accumulated failures of the Soviet model to produce the economic development and political legitimacy that might have given the communist governments a genuine social base. The Cold War competition had contributed to those failures by placing enormous military burdens on economies that could not sustain them. But the immediate trigger of the revolutions was the recognition, on the part of both the reforming governments and the populations of Eastern Europe, that Gorbachev's Soviet Union was not going to use military force to preserve communist rule as previous Soviet leaders had done in Hungary in 1956 and Czechoslovakia in 1968. The fall of the Berlin Wall on November 9, 1989, was a moment of genuine historical significance, a visible rupture in the physical architecture of the Cold War that had stood for 28 years. But the wall was a symbol of the division of Europe rather than the mechanism that maintained it. The mechanisms that maintained it, the nuclear arsenals, the command and control systems, the targeting databases, the early warning networks, the alliances and their planning staffs, these did not fall with the wall. They continued to exist, to be maintained, to be updated. The Cold War ended as a political relationship and as a geopolitical competition. It did not end as a military infrastructure. The Soviet Union itself dissolved in December of 1991, when the leaders of Russia, Ukraine and Belarus signed the Belovezh Accords, declaring the Soviet Union dissolved and establishing a commonwealth of independent states. This was an extraordinary event. The peaceful dissolution of a nuclear superpower, something that had no historical precedent. The former Soviet nuclear arsenal was distributed across 4 successor states: Russia, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and Belarus. The question of how to manage this inheritance, how to ensure that the weapons remained secure, how to transfer control to a single successor state, how to prevent the materials and expertise from proliferating to other actors, became one of the most complex and urgent security challenges of the post-Cold War period. The Nunn-Lugar Cooperative Threat Reduction Program, established in 1991, was an American effort to address this challenge by providing resources and technical assistance for the secure storage and eventual destruction of former Soviet nuclear weapons and materials. It was an unusual program in which a country was spending money to help dismantle the nuclear arsenal that had been aimed at it for decades. The logic was straightforward. A world with 1 major nuclear arsenal was less dangerous than a world with 5, and a world in which nuclear materials were tightly controlled was less dangerous than one in which they were poorly secured and potentially available to any actor willing to pay for them. But Nunn-Lugar and the other non-proliferation efforts of the 1990s could not address the fundamental continuity of the nuclear enterprise in Russia and in the United States. Russia retained thousands of strategic nuclear warheads and maintained its command and control infrastructure, its early warning systems, its targeting databases. It maintained the doctrine of nuclear deterrence that it had inherited from the Soviet Union, adapted to new circumstances but not fundamentally different in its logic. The United States maintained its own arsenal, its own command structure, its own planning systems. The two countries removed their weapons from day-to-day alert postures in some respects, but both retained the ability to launch on relatively short timelines. The nuclear infrastructure that had been built during the Cold War had an institutional life that extended beyond the political circumstances that had created it. The laboratories that designed the weapons continued to employ scientists who continued to work on nuclear issues. The military commands responsible for nuclear forces continued to exist and to plan. The defense contractors who built the delivery systems continued to build and maintain them. The training programs that produced nuclear specialists continued to train nuclear specialists. All of this continued because the organizations that conducted these activities had their own interests in their continuation, because the legal and policy frameworks that governed nuclear forces continued to require them, and because no political decision had been made to fundamentally alter the structure. The treaties that were signed in the post-Cold War period, START I in 1991, START II in 1993, though it never fully entered into force, the Moscow Treaty of 2002, New START in 2010, produced genuine reductions in the number of deployed strategic warheads. The numbers came down from the peaks of the Cold War period, when each side had tens of thousands of warheads, to the ranges specified in the treaties, which were still in the thousands for deployed strategic weapons and which did not address tactical weapons, non-deployed weapons held in storage, or the full range of delivery systems. The reductions were significant and real. They did not eliminate the problem. The command and control systems, the early warning infrastructure, the targeting databases, the operational procedures, the doctrines, the institutional cultures that had been formed around nuclear weapons during the Cold War, all of these continued. The fundamental logic of nuclear deterrence, the idea that the possession of nuclear weapons and the credible threat of their use could prevent certain kinds of conflict, continued to underlie the strategic thinking of the states that possessed them. The systems that had been built to make the threat credible, that had been designed to function automatically, to reduce the role of human decision, to ensure response even if leadership was destroyed, those systems continued to exist and to be maintained. The infrastructure that had come closest to ending the world had been built to prevent the world from ending, and the fact that it had not ended the world was taken by the people who had built it as evidence that it had worked. This logic was not entirely wrong. The Cold War did not become a hot war. Nuclear weapons were not used. The confrontation between the superpowers did not produce the annihilation that it was theoretically capable of producing. Something worked. Whether what worked was the deliberate design of deterrence or the repeated good fortune of having the right person in the right place at the right time, whether it was Arkhipov on the submarine or Petrov at his console, is a question that the historical record does not answer with any confidence. What the historical record does answer is that the systems which sustained the Cold War did not dissolve when the Cold War ended. The warheads remained in their silos. The submarines continued their patrols. The early warning satellites continued to watch. The command centers remained staffed. The procedures remained in force. The institutional memory of what to do if the warning came remained embedded in the training and the culture of the organizations responsible for nuclear forces on both sides. The Cold War had been a preparation for a war that was never fought, and the preparations had been so thorough, so institutionalized, so deeply embedded in the military and political structures of the states involved, that the end of the competition they were designed to support did not produce their dismantlement. The preparations persisted. The war they were prepared for had simply not yet arrived.